What's Happening, 1976. Cast reveals what most fans never figured out. What if the man who created one of television's most beloved black sitcoms ended up living in a homeless shelter, while the networks kept profiting for decades? What's Happening made America laugh from 1976, warm and funny, and quietly groundbreaking. But behind the hey, 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 the real stories were staggering. A creator erased from his own legacy, a star who burned through $1 million in 3 years, a 10-year-old actress who woke from a coma to build an entirely different life, and a mother who walked away from fame on pure principle. How much did Hollywood really owe them? Stay to the very end and subscribe to Secret Celebrity Stories, where the forgotten are finally remembered. Eric Monte. Every great show begins with a single mind, and few origin stories are as moving or as painful as the one belonging to the man that history very nearly erased. Eric Monte, born Kenneth Williams on December 25, 1943, in Chicago, is the creative force who dreamed up What's Happening, adapting it loosely from his own film Cooley High, which he had in turn drawn straight from his own upbringing in the Cabrini Green housing projects. When the show premiered in 1976, it became the first African-American, teen-focused sitcom to break into the national conversation, and Monte's fingerprints were, by then, all over the landscape of 1970s black television. He created Good Times, he wrote for the Jeffersons, and he helped shape an entire era of how black families were finally allowed to be seen on American screens. But Monte came to believe that his ideas had been taken and used without the proper credit, and so he sued ABC, CBS, and the legendary producer Norman Lear, a case that reportedly sought as much as $300 million. In the end, he received roughly $1 million, and he later said he had turned down an earlier offer entirely on principle. The aftermath was devastating. Monte described being quietly blackballed across Hollywood, and by 2006, the very man who had made millions of people laugh was living in a Salvation Army shelter in Bell, California. And yet his story is not one of a man simply vanished into the past. Eric Monte is still alive today, a retired screenwriter now in his early 80s, and in recent years, a growing chorus of writers, historians, and podcasters has worked hard to restore his name to its rightful place. His story sits at the very heart of a larger, uncomfortable question about who truly owns the culture that black creators build. His life remains a wound the industry has never fully healed, living proof that the person who invents the joy is not always the one who is allowed to keep it, and a name that an entire generation of viewers deserves, at last, to know. Mabel King. She played a mother on television, and she fought like one in real life, on both sides of the camera, with the same fierce heart. Mabel King's portrayal of Mama Thomas, the sharp-tongued, no-nonsense, deeply loving matriarch of the Thomas household, was never merely a comic performance. It was a quiet statement about how black families deserve to be seen on American screens. And that very conviction is the reason she ultimately walked away from the show that made her famous. King left What's Happening after its second season in 1978, not over a salary dispute, and not for a better offer somewhere else, but over a fundamental disagreement about what the show ought to stand for. She had proposed that her character's ex-husband, Bill, return as a full-time presence, creating a two-parent black household at the very center of a major network sitcom, a kind of representation that barely existed anywhere on American television at the time. It was less a creative suggestion than a genuine moral argument. The producers declined, and Mabel King walked, choosing her principles over her paycheck. What so many fans never realized was how formidable her artistry already was. She had originated the role of Eveline, the Wicked Witch, in the original 1975 Broadway production of The Wiz, earning a Tony Award nomination, with a theatrical resume that predated her television fame by many years. Her later life brought suffering in relentless waves. Diabetes slowly took a toe, then one leg, then the other, and eventually an arm, while a stroke in 1990 ended her career and confined her to the motion picture country house. The loss of her son Larry in 1996 deepened the grief still further. Mabel King passed away on November 9, 1999, at the age of 66, a woman of towering principle whose final years deserved so much more gentleness than life ever gave her. Her refusal to compromise on how a black family should be portrayed cost her a steady role, but it left behind something far more lasting, a stand for dignity that still resonates with every viewer who understands what she was really fighting for. Fred Berry. The very moment Fred Berry walked into that audition room, he did something that no one else in the building had the nerve to do. The producers had written the character of Rerun as a skinny white kid, and Berry, a heavy-set, magnetically energetic black man who defied every single word of that description, looked them dead in the eye and simply declared, "I am a white, skinny guy." They rewrote the entire role on the spot. That one act of breathtaking self-belief gave American television one of its most unforgettable characters. Rerun's red beret, his suspenders, his explosive, joyful disco dancing, and his signature, "Hey, hey, hey," all became cultural shorthand for an entire generation. Berry embraced the character so completely that he legally changed his own middle name to Rerun. But behind all that laughter, he was quietly fighting battles the audience was never allowed to see. In a remarkably raw 1996 interview with People magazine, he admitted that he had burned through roughly $1 million in just 3 short years. On drugs, on real estate, on an airplane, on horses. And he spoke with painful honesty about how normalized heavy substance use had been on television sets in the 1970s. The personal toll was catastrophic, and during his very darkest years, Fred Berry survived 3 separate suicide attempts, along with total financial ruin and cruel public ridicule. When What's Happening Now launched in 1985, he returned as Rerun, but left after a single season over a pay dispute, publicly accusing the producers of racial inequity in how the cast was compensated. And then came one of the most beautiful turnarounds in all of entertainment. After completing treatment, Berry became a motivational speaker and was ordained a Baptist minister in Madison, Alabama, and he made his peace with Ernest Thomas before the end. Fred Berry passed away on October 21, 2003, at 52, from complications of a stroke, a man who, after so many years of struggle and public spectacle, finally found in his last chapter the quiet, hard-won peace that all his fame had never once been able to give him. Ernest Thomas. To win the role that would come to define his entire life, Ernest Thomas had to outshine 199 other actors, and that is not a figure of speech, but very nearly the literal truth of what happened when casting began for What's Happening. Back in 1976, born in Gary, Indiana, Thomas walked into that crowded audition room and simply outperformed every other person there. But the long road that led him to Raj was paved with far more than a single fortunate afternoon. Before television ever came calling, he had already built genuine theatrical credentials on the Broadway stage, appearing in Love for Love in 1974 and The Member of the Wedding in 1975, both productions that also happened to feature a then completely unknown young actress named Glenn Close. That deep grounding in serious dramatic work is precisely what made his Raj feel so real, so lived in, rather than merely performed for laughs. His closest brush with a different kind of television immortality came during the casting of Roots, the monumental 1977 miniseries that gripped the entire nation. Thomas made it all the way to the final 2 actors considered for the lead role of Kunta Kinte, which ultimately went to LeVar Burton, though Thomas did appear in Roots himself, in the smaller role of Cuba. Few fans ever knew much about his personal life either. He has spoken openly about a relationship with Kim Cattrall during the 1970s, long before her Sex and the City fame, back when she was still studying at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts. He also lives with amblyopia, commonly known as lazy eye, a physical reality that most viewers never even noticed on screen. After the original series ended, he reprised Raj in What's Happening Now, and has since built a steady, respected career across Martin, Malcolm X, and a wonderful recurring turn as the funeral director Mr. Omar on Everybody Hates Chris. Now in his 70s, Ernest Thomas endures as the disciplined craftsman at the very heart of the show, the actor who earned his place against nearly 200 hopefuls and who has quietly kept earning it, decade after decade, ever since. Shirley Hemphill. She did not sit around waiting for Hollywood to discover her. Instead, she mailed Hollywood a cassette tape and quietly dared it to answer her back. Shirley Ann Hemphill had been performing stand-up comedy while working factory jobs and waiting tables, living out the unglamorous, exhausting grind that lies behind almost every comedian's dream. But she recorded her own routine, sent that tape directly to Flip Wilson, one of the very biggest names in all of comedy at the time, and then she waited. Wilson was so genuinely impressed that he personally invited her to his set, and that single visit changed the entire course of her life. She quit the factory for good, moved out to Los Angeles, and began performing at the famous Comedy Store by night, while waiting tables by day to survive. Then the legendary Norman Lear took notice of her and offered her a spin-off from Good Times. Most struggling young performers would have leapt at an offer like that without a second thought. Shirley Hemphill turned it down, and instead auditioned for the role of Shirley Wilson on What's Happening, winning it entirely on her own terms, in a defining act of pure artistic confidence. As the sharp-tongued but warm-hearted waitress at Rob's Place, she became one of the show's most genuinely beloved figures, and the source of some of its very biggest laughs. When the series was eventually canceled, she auditioned for Archie Bunker's place and lost the part to Ann Miera. But the very next day, she was offered her own sitcom, One in a Million, in which she played a taxi driver who suddenly inherits a fortune. It premiered in 1980, but lasted only 13 episodes. She later returned as Shirley in What's Happening Now, and kept performing her stand-up on The Tonight Show. Shirley Hemphill passed away in December 1999, at just 52, from kidney failure, at her home in West Covina, California. A woman who bet everything she had on herself, at a moment when no one else was willing to, and who won that bet in front of the whole country. Danielle Spencer. Her story begins in sudden tragedy and ends in hard-won triumph, and the long distance between those 2 points runs straight through some of the most difficult terrain a human being can ever be asked to cross. On September 6, 1977, during the production of the show's second season, 10-year-old Danielle Spencer, who played Dee, the whip-smart, tattletale little sister audiences adored, was involved in a catastrophic car accident alongside her beloved stepfather, Tim Pelt. Pelt died from the injuries he sustained, while physically shielding young Danielle from the full force of the impact. She survived, but she fell into a coma that lasted 3 weeks, and to this day, she retains no memory whatsoever of the crash, having spent 6 long months in rehabilitation while the show itself halted taping for about a month so that she could begin to recover. But rather than allowing that profound trauma to define the limits of her life, she chose instead to let it define her very direction. Her stepfather had lovingly encouraged her early interest in veterinary medicine before his death, and so, to honor him, she pursued that field with truly remarkable discipline, attending UC Davis, and then the veterinary school at Tuskegee University, earning her degree in 1996, all while still playing Dee in What's Happening Now throughout her college years. And the challenges were still not finished with her. In 2004, spinal stenosis, a direct, delayed consequence of that 1977 accident, required surgery that left her partially paralyzed for 8 months, a stretch so dark that she came close to giving up entirely, until her mother stepped in, moving her to the New Jersey rehabilitation team that had once treated Christopher Reeve, a decision that ultimately saved her ability to walk. Then, in 2014, came a breast cancer diagnosis, which she faced head-on and publicly, documenting her whole journey in a memoir titled Through the Fire. Danielle Spencer has now practiced veterinary medicine in California for more than 25 years, living, breathing proof that survival can be transformed into genuine purpose. Haywood Nelson. He was only 16 years old when he first stepped onto the set of What's Happening, and by the time the show had become a genuine hit, Haywood Nelson had quietly become something that American television had very rarely seen before him, one of the first black teenage idols on primetime. The teen magazines of the era featured his face, and young viewers all across the country nursed crushes on him. He represented an entirely new kind of visibility for black youth. in an era when that visibility was still very much being fought for, inch by inch. But Nelson was never once content simply to be famous. Before he ever joined What's Happening, he had already completed a full 2-year run on Broadway in the play Thieves, a production that demanded real and serious craft. And at just 14, he had guest starred on Sanford and Son and its spin-off, Grady. By the time he joined the cast, he was already a seasoned professional performer, carrying credits that most actors twice his age simply could not match. What audiences never could have anticipated, though, was just how completely he would eventually step away from the spotlight. Not in any kind of defeat, but in deliberate, clear-eyed reinvention. During the production of What's Happening Now, Nelson was simultaneously pursuing serious studies in architectural design and electronics engineering. And he did not merely act in that revival. He actually served as its technical director, working behind the camera with the very same commitment he had once poured into performing in front of it. After the revival finally ended, he transitioned fully to the technical side of the industry, working as a camera assistant, then as a screenwriter and an international film distributor. And today, he works as a lighting technician and stagehand on major productions including Late Night with Jimmy Fallon. He is also a founding partner in 2 separate companies, married and a father of 3. Haywood Nelson is that rarest of things, a child star who rebuilt his entire life on his own quiet terms, thriving far from the fame he never truly needed. 7 lives behind one of television's warmest half hours, and almost none of them ended up where you'd expect. A creator who dreamed up an era of black sitcoms, then landed in a shelter while the networks profited for decades. A mother who gave up fame on principle. Stars who fought demons the cameras never showed, and won. So here's the question worth arguing about. Does Hollywood owe these people more than history ever gave them? When the person who invents the joy gets erased from the credits, is that just how the business works? Or is it something closer to theft? Tell us honestly where you stand in the comments. And subscribe to Secret Celebrity Stories, where forgotten names are remembered.